Hey everyone, I'm Andrea Ferretti, and this is episode 254 of Yogaland. Hi there, Jason.
Hi, Andrea.
I think today I'm the guest.
It's always difficult to know. Let's say this. Let's say you are without a doubt the voice of reason and the specialist within this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about content.
Yes.
And I'm going to do a little series that's going to be all related to each other. But this one, the focus is how to create what I call weekly content.
Yes.
How to ensure you are able to do it, how to fuel yourself with ideas.
Yeah, and I want to give just like the tiniest bit of context from the perspective of being a yoga teacher. I think a lot of times yoga teachers think in weeks. What am I going to teach this week? What am I going to teach next week? So you're going to talk about weekly content and some nuances and layers to that. But as we do this, for any yoga teacher that's listening and gets kind of like, they're not going to get lost in the message, but we should really understand we already think this way, right? We already often think in terms of weekly content in classes. So now you can talk a little bit about weekly content in non-classes and what you mean about the options for weekly content and what you mean about what do you think the best way for yoga teachers to create weekly content and why?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's start with the why. There's so many whys, but I'm just going to try to stay really focused for this conversation. I do go into more of the whys in my course, but the main reason is to get people to sign up for your newsletter.
So kind of an end game is to get people via content to become part of your newsletter and your educational network.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So really, and I will do another episode about why newsletters are so important.
Sure.
But they are, in many ways, the most important part of your digital presence. So they are your people, your community. They have agreed to give you their email address, their direct communication, in exchange for giving them content. Whereas social networks can change at any time. They can be acquired. They can just change their algorithms completely. We experienced that with Facebook a number of years ago and kind of stopped using Facebook because of it. So when you have people as a part of your email list, you have a direct way that you can communicate with them, a direct way to tell them what you're offering, and a way to just stay top of mind for them.
Right.
So in order to get people to subscribe to your newsletter, I think it's really important to give them regular weekly content. I think it's really important to give them something in exchange.
Yeah.
And I tell people in my course, and I tell people live when we used to teach live.
And you're telling them now.
And I'm telling you now that if weekly just feels like, oh my God, I can't do it, I can't add one more thing, that's fine. It's really also very important to balance what you can do with what's sustainable and what you can do in the long term. So if you need to start every other week, that's fine. If you need to start once a month with some kind of piece of content, that's fine too. But just start, and whatever you start with, be consistent.
Okay. So right now, I have an intuition of what you mean when you say content. But content is a huge term. And so when you say weekly content or bi-weekly content or monthly content, to be top of mind for people and have those people ultimately join your newsletter and become part of your community, can you dial in a little bit more as to what you mean about content? And does my Monday morning Instagram post about what I ate for breakfast count as content?
Wait for breakfast? No.
I've never put that in, but
no, I know.
Yeah.
For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to say, a post on Instagram, a Twitter thread that you start. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to say no. This is not what I mean by this kind of content. I'm thinking about content that is educational, adds value to their life and their yoga practice, and is in kind of a bigger format. So the examples that I hone in on are, a blog post. That's kind of an obvious one. You can also, if a blog post even feels like too much because you're like, I don't have the blog set up yet, I'm not ready, but I do have the newsletter. It could be a couple of paragraphs that you write at the top of your newsletter. It could be tips in your newsletter. It could be content directly in your newsletter.
Okay.
Or if you want to go the video route, which I think is really smart. I mean, Instagram is getting more and more, focused on video. You could do an Instagram Live or a Facebook Live if you use Facebook. And then I think for people who are more comfortable with content and more advanced, you could think about like a YouTube tutorial or a series of podcasts, like a short series of podcasts. I've never done anything in my teaching about how to start a podcast, even though it's the main piece of content that I have, because I do think for yoga teachers, unless you have the infrastructure, I don't know that a long-term podcast is really the biggest bang for your buck.
Yeah.
I think, but lately I've been like, you know what? A 6-series podcast for a yoga teacher with a very specific niche could be very helpful. And there are people out there who do those, like Susan Cain, who's been on my show, has a short, I think it's a 10-series podcast. And then she ultimately promotes herself on this educational platform that she has. Elizabeth Gilbert, when she came out with a book on creativity, she did a 6 to 10 series podcast about creativity. So something like that would be worthwhile for a yoga teacher. But I think thinking about like a podcast forever is a lot.
So, okay, on 2 things. Number 1, I don't think you need to create a podcast about how to create a podcast.
No.
Because creating a podcast isn't inherently subject specific, right? So it's not like the world lacks resources for figuring out and learning how to create a podcast. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when I think about this in terms of my existing internal framework for what it is to be a yoga teacher, it's kind of like in any given class, I'm going to teach a lot of postures. But there needs to be something that anchors those postures. There needs to be some sort of postural theme or continuity, some sort of philosophical or spiritual theme or continuity. There's got to be some kind of overriding meta infrastructure that helps kind of maintain the integrity of the week. Or for me, I actually think about it as a month, not a week. But the point is, I think that this is a place where yoga teachers can think, look, you're going to have all sorts of different posts if you post regularly, but a post about your outfit this week isn't necessarily content that's going to help people know who you are and what you're teaching and what they're going to learn and benefit from by being part of your newsletter. Right?
Yes.
The other thing that I want to say is, because we'll get to some of the questions later about insecurities and doubts around this. But for me, the place I actually come up with the content that you're describing, which for me is usually in the form of podcasts and video tutorials, but the place where I come up with my content is in the classes I'm teaching. Mm-hmm. So I start with class first. Mm-hmm. And I think, what's the top of the class? What's the focal point of the class? What's the intensity of the class? What is the arc of that class built around? What am I really trying to teach when I teach class on Tuesday?
Yeah.
And then I can then pull that out and then write about it in our blog. Or I can pull that out and do a Yogaland Teacher's Companion on it. Or I can pull that out and say to you, hey, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in my classes, boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
So for yoga teachers who are thinking, well, where do I come up with this content? What I want to remind them of is, well, you do 60 minutes of content all the time. Mm-hmm. So what is the most salient thing about what you're teaching on Monday night? Okay, well then let's craft that into a Yogaland, Instagram Live, or a blog post, or this mini run of podcast that you're describing, but something that really anchors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny. would you like to be a guest lecturer in my course? Because that would be something that's very useful to put at the top of the course that I didn't think of because I'm not a yoga teacher.
Right.
The way that I help people think of ideas, and it's kind of related to this, but I just give people 3 options to think about, and then the confluence of those options are great ideas, or each of them individually. So one is, what are you great at teaching? Like what is natural to you as a teacher?
Or most great. For those of you that are horribly insecure or Midwestern, if you can't deal with what are you great at, what are you like most okay at?
What are you most okay at in your teaching?
Yeah.
What do you see your students struggling with?
Yeah.
Right? Anytime you're solving problems for people with content, it's just incredibly useful. So what are your students struggling with? And if you can't tell, like during class, what kind of questions do people ask you after class?
Yeah.
Who comes up to you and asks you a question? If one person did, in all likelihood, someone else had a similar question. And then the third thing is just kind of, what are you into right now in your yoga practice? What if you were to go out for coffee with a yoga friend and you were going to talk about yoga? Like, what would you talk about? What do you feel passionate about? Even if that passion is something that's being taught in yoga right now that drives you crazy, right? So any of those kinds of ways of thinking about practice and teaching can be helpful to come up with ideas.
I think to allay a concern here too is you are inevitably going to say things that other people also say.
Yeah.
And you don't want to not say them because someone else says them. Mm-hmm. You don't want to think to yourself, oh, well, I'm not going to do a post on end range strength because Jason did a post on end range strength. Because the reality is there are going to be people that listen to you and not me. Mm-hmm. And similarly, the way you say it is going to be at least a little bit different than how I say it. It's going to be filtered through your experience, not through my experience.
Right.
And different people have different degrees of receptivity to what's being said, depending on who's saying it.
It's so true. It's so true.
Right? So usually we're more receptive to hearing something when we have an established relationship with that person. So these kind of like these pieces of content, even if you saw me do a mobility thing on shoulders, do your own mobility thing on shoulders. Mm-hmm. Let there be crossover, because the way you do it in the population that experiences you is different than me.
Totally.
And also, there are things we all know in life that for them to be actuated, they have to be heard many times. So if the same person hears it, right? So if the same person hears your thing about content and my thing about content and so-and-so's thing about content, well, that's okay. Then that person gets to hear it from 3 different voices with 3 slightly different perspectives.
Yeah.
And it takes time to actuate it, right? I want to circle back really quick and just make sure like we really land on what types of format do you see this kind of anchor content for the week? Where is it? Like if I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do content once a week, tell me again, like, what are the 3 to 5 places that I can do that? Like, where is it and what does it actually equal?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking me this question, but I do think that wherever it is, you should decide on one type of content or one place and do it there for at least, a month or 2.
Okay.
So it could be a blog post on your own website.
Got it.
And by the way, this is sort of a whole other level, but if it's easy for you to create blog posts and you already have a blog, then start thinking about guest posting other places. But anyway, it could be a blog post on your own site. It could be a live format, so Instagram Live or Facebook Live or YouTube Live if you already are that established. Or what else did I say? A series of podcasts or YouTube videos.
You have in our notes also office hours.
Well, yeah, so I think that was more like, so in terms of lives, there's lots of sub ideas under lives.
Yeah.
Right? So, because if you just be just saying, oh, go do a live, you might be like, no way
So
am I
maybe-
turning on my camera and doing a live. So that's where I'm talking about the structure.
So this is giving me an idea. So I don't know that I will do this, but so I do these teaching companions now, right?
Right.
So theoretically, I could do an office hour based on episode 7 on shoulder range of motion, right? To kind of provide an open, like a weekly forum. Okay, this week we're going to talk about X. This week we're going to talk about Y. So let's say I did that, or let's say the listener did that, which sounds better to me because I don't want to have to do that right now.
Well, you're already producing your weekly content with your yoga teachers
Right.
companion.
But here's the idea, right? It's like, because I think that we can get a little overwhelmed when we lack structure, and it's like every week I'm going to do an Instagram live. Okay, well maybe one week a month, it's just Q&A based on what you've done the previous 3 weeks.
Sure.
Right.
I
So
mean,
just
let's
kind
just start. Okay, so let's start with the idea of structure.
Okay.
So I do think it's very important that you pick your medium. So whether you're going to do your blog post, you're going to do your podcast, you're going to do some YouTube videos, or you're going to do some lives. Pick your medium. Which one sings to you? Which one feels the most comfortable to you? And then you pick up what I learned, from years of magazine publishing, which is you pick a format or a topic. So magazines have they have the middle of the magazine, which is like the long feature stories, 3,000 words plus. They have the front of the book, which is like those short little things in beauty magazines. It's like, the little product pages. Last page of the magazine is always a short piece. And then you have your departments or your columns. So those are things that run every month, and they are typically topic specific.
Yeah.
So at Yoga Journal, we had an anatomy column every month. We had a home practice column every month. Different magazines might have a very famous columnist that they feature every month. And that columnist always talks about politics or, whatever it is. So you decide, like if you're going to do an Instagram live, you might say to yourself, you're not going to just show up on Instagram and turn the camera on. You're going to think, what do I feel comfortable doing?
Right.
And the easiest low-hanging fruit example that I always give is you're going to teach a 10-minute meditation.
Yeah.
Okay. Or you're going to teach
hips and core.
Right.
Hips and core.
Hips and core. You're going to teach a morning wake up yoga, and it's going to be every Monday at 9 a.m. and it's going to be 10 to 20 minutes. And if you decide you're going to do that, then guess what? You have some Instagram posts to promote it leading up to that. Promoting that 9 a.m. Instagram live, I'm going to be there. You can put that in your newsletter. 9 a.m. Instagram live, this is what I'm going to teach. And you can then think of other posts or related content to create about meditation, about how you teach, about why it feels good, about why you love it, about why you think it's going to benefit them. So it gives you, once you have that focal point of what your content is going to be, then you can start to promote it. If you're going to do office hours, you could do office hours for a month. And you could say, 1 week we're going to talk about, I don't know.
Uddiyana Bandha.
Yeah,
That would be a weird office
that would be a little weird for an Instagram office hours. But, another idea
There's
is...
more there than Jalandhara Bandha.
Another idea is if you wanted to just do monthly content is you could do a book club and you could, have a couple of readings that they do and you could sort of promote it in your newsletter. And then we're going to meet live on, Sunday, January 10th and talk about our book. And it could be directly yoga philosophy, or it could just be a book about yoga or a book a yoga teacher has recently written that really resonates with you, that you think is interesting to talk about. There's just so many ideas.
Yeah, so I think this is also a really important thing to further punctuate, which is this idea. I talk to my students in trainings all the time. This is some of the most important things I tell people, but to me it's also some of the most potentially painful things I tell people, which is you can't, as a teacher, effectively teach and make a career out of teaching random things for the rest of your life. You have to develop continuity. And you have to think in terms of, if a student comes to you for 6 months, do they have 6 months of good classes? Or do they have 6 months of good classes where they actually have measurable skill development and acquisition? Are those 6 months a bunch of random things that felt good? And if so, that's good. I mean, that's good. But if that person knows more about down dog and triangle pose and how to do back bends and how their core works, and if there is an education to boot, so that you didn't just take 6 months of good feeling classes, but you led them through a process. And that is difficult, and that's a very long subset of questions, right? But when you work backwards as a yoga teacher, when you work backwards from saying, I want people to feel really welcome and really good in this class, and I want them to learn the 2 options of how to position their pelvis for back bends. When you work backwards from that, then you have more to work with. When you figure out, well, what standing poses are you going to include? What lunges are you going to include? What techniques are you going to include? They're not random anymore. They're well, I'm going to teach a lot of things, but they're going to focus on these 2 different options of tilting the pelvis and back bends. So same thing when it comes to content within social media or blog or podcast or newsletter. When you have an anchor, then you have other things that you can build around that anchor to promote that anchor. So your social media for that week can be based on that kind of anchor piece.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it can also lead you to creating deeper class content. I mean, if you are teaching something this way and creating content around it, and it really resonates with people, and you feel like, oh my gosh, they are so hungry for this and they want to know more, you could then create a workshop out of it.
Correct. So I want the last part of our conversation, I want you to address my doubts.
Right.
Not my doubts about what you're saying. My doubts
Self-doubt.
about yeah. My doubts about whether or not this effort is worth it, and whether or not people are going to care. You know, and there's one thing I say to people all the time. I say to myself is, one of the things we have to remember is how demented our timeline in life has gotten. I say this all the time. Like, I can arrive at any city in the world, pretty much, push a button on my phone, and be irritated if it takes more than 6 minutes for a car to pick me up and whisk me to where I'm going.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have a very sensible relationship to how much time and investment developing content and a student base actually takes. So my first doubt that comes up is, well, my existing audience is too small. Like, I don't want to do an Instagram Live for 3 people. I don't want to start a newsletter for like Jim and Sally and then whatever. It's too small. It's not worth it.
You have to start somewhere. And you said it really well when you said we have sort of a demented timeline. We think everything's supposed to happen yesterday.
Yeah.
And we also just have so much FOMO. So it is not healthy to compare yourself to people on the internet is the first starting place.
It's not?
No, it's not. I know. It seems so enticing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So enticing.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not healthy. And you also we've talked about this before, but you want to think about the people who are actually there.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I think it was Glennon Doyle who first said this.
I thought it was me.
Where I heard it, where she said, 30 people show up for an Instagram Live, let's say, and you're like, oh God, but if you were in a room of 30 people, that would be a packed yoga class.
Yeah.
If you have 300 people on your newsletter list after a year, oh man, I only have 300 people. I've heard so-and-so has 10,000 people, and Amy Porterfield has 100,000 people, whatever. If you were in a room full, if you were in a church of 300 people, that's a full church of
Sure.
people to talk to. So
Some churches.
certainly, right, that's true. I don't know.
But
I've
scale,
never been
but
to the mega
scale,
churches.
right?
Right.
And we were kind of talking about this earlier. It doesn't matter how small you are, because the most important people are the people that are actually listening to you.
Yeah.
So if it's 30 people, it's 30 people. If it's 3 people, it's 3 people. And you do have to start somewhere. And every single yoga teacher, including myself, just has to go through periods of time in their development where not many people come to class. Like, I literally cannot tell people the number of years I would have 1 to 4 people in class. I'm not saying weeks, I'm saying years of my teaching life. And so what did I have to do? I had to teach those 1 to 4 people, you know? And this is, in some ways, like, I hate to say it, this is like the most tough love I get. It's like, this is, in part, is gonna let you know whether or not this role is for you.
Yeah.
It really is. Because you are, the vast majority of teachers are gonna toil in a small visibility location for the majority of their work life, right? And then the other thing to think of too is, like, anyone that is listening to us, right? Anyone who's paying attention to us might think that we are popular, and they might compare themselves to us. But if we compare ourselves on YouTube to Yoga with Adrian,
We're nothing.
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 You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I can guarantee whoever starts a YouTube channel from this conversation has there's like a smaller gap
Yeah. Between
our audience and your audience than our audience and
Yoga with
also,
Adrian.
or Kino, or like all these
Right.
other, right, who have been doing this and doing this well in this medium consistently for an extremely long time. And so I think that's kind of the next thing that comes up for me
Wait,
is,
can I just
Yeah.
comment? So I think that another aspect of this is accepting that creating content is now part of the job.
it is.
It's part of the job now. So if it's part of the job and it doesn't immediately yield you the result that you wish or hope or feel as though it should be yielding you, you have to just see it as part of your growth in your job.
Yeah.
You every time you create content, just like every time you teach, you learn something.
Yeah.
You learn more about the subject.
Yeah.
You learn more about your voice, about how to articulate your message. You're a teacher. You're a messenger. You have
Right.
things to say. That's why you decided to become a yoga teacher.
Yeah.
So this is just another medium or set of mediums for you to communicate your message. And maybe this is actually helping you to figure out, hone in more and more on what that message is. That's what it can be if you allow it to be.
So related to this is also my feeling of, this is okay, this sounds good, I can do this. And then a couple of weeks in or a couple of months in, this isn't working. How do I deal with that feeling?
Well, there are definitely, I do think it's important to benchmark against yourself. I don't think it's important to necessarily benchmark against others. I mean, I do give people industry standards in terms of there are standard open rates on newsletters
Specifically for
different,
newsletter,
for
right.
different industries. There are industry click-through rates for specific categories, right? So we would be in health and fitness category. And I do give people those. But I think it's more important to look at your own, to just start by looking at your own numbers. And you can start really simple, because there's so many ways you can slice and dice data now, but just starting really simple with, like, how many newsletter subscribers do you have? Do you have more now?
So right
or do
now,
you have fewer? What's your open rate? Is it better, the same, worse? And what's your click-through rate? Is it better, the same, worse?
so you're starting to get into, like, a little bit more overtly into newsletters. So we're going to have another conversation. So let's kind of pause on that, because I think we want to spend a whole conversation talking about why newsletters
Yeah.
and
So-
how to grow them. But this does circle back to the earlier end game of this content development and this content structure and this content consistency. An end game to that is getting people to subscribe to your newsletter. It's also getting people to attend your classes. And I think the final thing, and this came up in our conversation off air when we were developing this, is I don't think that most teachers focus on student retention as much as they should. And I think that one of the things we have to think of when we think about, like, is this working? It's not just about are my numbers going up? It's, are the people that are my students yesterday still my students today? Am I giving my students a reason to continue to come back to my website, to come back to open my email list, to come back to my class? I think in most, just thinking about business, what most businesses know that most yoga teachers aren't trained in is the vast majority of businesses make the vast majority of their revenues on return clients. And it's the same for us as teachers. And not even just the business side, but the joy side, the satisfaction side. I find much more satisfaction when I have a class full of people that I've seen before than a class full of people I've never seen. And so I think that we spend so much time thinking about, well, I'm going to keep doing this and doing this and doing this in hopes that more people start following me and my numbers go up. That's a part of it. But what we can't overlook is, can we continue to create content that engages the people that are already engaged with us?
Yes, for sure. And I think that in that sense, you can also get kind of a feel for, are people engaging with you? Are people talking, when you're teaching, does anyone tell you they got your newsletter? And I just recently responded to a student of mine who, I follow her newsletter now, and she wrote this beautiful piece about just body image, and it was so resonant with me that I emailed her back and I was like, thanks, I needed this today.
Yeah.
So, are you getting any of that from people who know you and have been your students? So you're right. I mean, there is sort of the data, and then there's also like the anecdotal response.
Yeah.
But in terms of, sometimes things aren't working for you. Sometimes you will create a series of content and you're kind of done with that series.
Yeah.
Or the format just isn't feeling right, or you want to try something new, and that is fine too. This doesn't have to be something that you commit to in blood for a year or two. You can start, I like to think of things quarterly, but you can start with a month, you can start with 2 months, see how it goes. Let yourself experiment. This is not something that, creating your own job, which is essentially what yoga teachers do. You can call it your own job, your own career, your own business. It's not going to happen from right out the gate. It's not going to happen from the first, series of content you create isn't going to, land you a sponsorship with Nike. Like, these things just, like you said, they just take time, and they take the ability, the willingness to experiment, and the willingness to even maybe sometimes fail in your own eyes, and then just get up and keep going and figure out the next thing that you're going to do. But it's important to show up for the process. Yeah. It's important to, and I think that this is something that really gets in people's way when creating content. It's kind of like, well, who am I to put, I don't have hair and makeup. I'm not good at writing a 3,000 word story. We get into this idea that you have to be something, or it has to be something in order to be valuable. Well, this is where I go back to what you say about teaching, which is, it's the yoga that's valuable.
Right. Right,
and
right.
and it's the yoga that you want to be the message to people. And however you teach that, however you approach it, is your unique way. But think about showing up for people because you think yoga is important.
Yeah.
And I just think this all the time. And it's sincere. I mean, if there was more and more and more messaging and teaching about yoga out there, I think the world would be a better place. So that's what I always come back to, always. That's the foundation of it, and that's what keeps me going.
I think that's the final word.
Okay. Got very passionate there.
You did get very passionate
I
there. I'm
did.
not adding on to any. We have not only known each other, we've been married for long enough that was a strong enough statement piece that I'm not going to step on top of that.
Thanks. Henry.
And I agree,
Thank
of course,
you.
100% all the time.
All right. Well, thanks so much for watching and for listening. And we will put show notes at yogalandpodcast.com/episode 254. If you have not followed us already, you can follow the podcast on YouTube. You can follow it wherever you're listening right now. And you can also join our newsletter at jasonyoga.com/newsletter.
Yeah, this is kind of our content, so join our newsletter.
Join our newsletter. Exactly.
Let's like
I'm bringing it full
prove the
circle.
whole thing.
I'm bringing it full circle.
Yeah,
That was
let's
part of the
prove
plan.
the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Until next week, enjoy your practice.